So Alex Leatherwood's a player who I like more than I thought I was going to when I just kind of watched him casually. He is extremely talented, former five-star recruit, moved all around Bama's line. He's got a lot of game experience overall. He's got some issues with like overall technique, certain situations of like redirecting, and just like his overall like hand usage in certain situations. But this guy's a big time athlete. Ran sub 5, 34.5 inch vertical, 9'10" broad jump with this, which is out of this world, and it shows up on tape too. But overall, I think his flaws are relatively fixable. They're more fixable than players without the tools that this guy has. And I've seen this guy below like Dylan Radins and Jackson Carman, which I don't really get. Maybe I'm wrong. But I think there's some promise with this guy. So here's a pass rep I like in 2019. I think Leatherwood, he's got a pretty strong anchor and he's really athletic. He has some questions about like redirecting when you're getting completely upfield and then you have to redirect back inside against certain moves, and especially like considering looking at 2019 versus 2020, the context of them being more of like an RPO offense in general. I had some concerns there. But I think with Leatherwood, like projecting him as like more of like a developmental style tackle because of the really good tools, the 7 foot wingspan, the explosive jump numbers. He's athletic on tape. I think he's a player where if you look at like the overall hand fighting, I don't think he's a player who needs to be like an absolute technician. And so when you watch defensive linemen gain control of the wrist in certain situations, I think he's going to be okay because of his overall like trait profile. Here's a play I like from Leatherwood because it shows his ability to be reactive with his hands in a way that doesn't just focus on the outside half of the rusher with his outside half. So it looks like 10's going for like either a long arm or a one arm stab. And he's very quick to disengage this. Sees it coming, but he's disengaging it with his inside arm. That's really quick, and he finishes the rep. And I think it shows signs that he can improve in hand fighting and like overall technique and tendency recognition in a way that like it extends to like his overall game, because this is just a good play. That's reactive, and using his inside arm instead of his outside arm doesn't compromise his overall positioning. Just in case he misses that, he's going to be okay either way. Here's a reach block Leatherwood has on a tight 3 tech over here that helped him during this long long hurdle run that Najee Harris had in the Notre Dame game. And I think the two things to highlight with this play are it illustrates that two traits. One, obviously like mobility, lateral movement skills to just get in position. Two, the overall control. And you can tell that by when he plants initially that he's golden here. Because I'll see sometimes like linemen moving very fast, but like they're not in complete control. They're not going up against a player who can expose them like certain NFL players in terms of like the overall power, because you have to be under control too. You don't just have to get to the landmark. And Leatherwood showcases that, and that's why I think you can do a lot of stuff with him, like in terms of scheme versatility. If you ask me whether he's a guard or a tackle right away, I'd probably lean guard, but the overall skill set required for both, and in terms of like what he has to develop in, I think is relatively similar. And that's why I have him listed as a tackle, but like it is influenced by like how well I think he can play guard. So in 2020, I think there were more reps where rushers would pull off like a cross chop move, which is becoming kind of more relevant at like high college and NFL levels. And I think Leatherwood's had like varying success with like dealing with this for a couple of reasons. I think part of it has to do with like how he uses his outside arm, where he kind of will just like put it out there to try to get a jab in, but we talked about it not being like completely purposeful, and it's a little bit predictable too. And so I think if you are like a player who can execute a good cross chop, it's like a timing thing too, because if you use the inside arm to disengage that outside hand, Leatherwood sometimes is more like keying the outside half. And so it can kind of like sneak up on you if you're using the inside arm for like the first part of this move. And then you're disengaging the outside arm. And if you can flatten that path, it's really hard to recover once that outside arm is disengaged. And I think part of it has to do with like Leatherwood being more predictable with like putting that outside arm out there forward to get disengaged in the first place and put him behind the rush. And so the fear with Leatherwood is rushers in the NFL are going to be able to disengage that outside arm, cut that angle really close, and get to the quarterback consistently on these types of like chops and anything to disengage the outside arm. But there are a lot of reps where even when he's not fully like grabbing cloth, it can be hard to actually disengage the outside arm just due to like his overall like stoutness and strength. But this is an example of like strength being a recovery trait, and I think you see this sometimes where he doesn't put himself in the best position because that outside arm's like a little bit predictable in terms of how he uses it. But the strength can save him on a lot of reps. So I think if you can kind of like clean up this technique overall, not technique, but just overall like tendency. Because rushers in the SEC definitely saw this and tried to exploit it. And that's why you saw more of the cross chop moves on a lot of sequences, especially the Georgia game too. But I think if you can like change this up a little bit to where you're in this situation less times and you also have the strength to save you in case you do leave that outside arm out there, I think there's more promise to get better at this at the next level. And if you're just watching a lot of my lineman videos, you probably just think that I want to move every tackle to guard. Not completely the case with Leatherwood. I view this more as in a complementary way. He's just good at some stuff that really good guards are also good at. Like in terms of like down blocks, like on this like 30-degree plane, he just gets a lot of movement. A lot. And part of this is like he is very aggressive. He's got like this like head, like he does get a lot of like forward tilt on like some of the run blocks. Part of that is he's just coming out so explosive out of his stance. But in terms of like this one isolated skill, he's very good at. And he would be up there with a lot of guards in terms of his ability to down block. Now we talked about him having like wide hands and high hands. I think this is an example of that. He's going to pick up a flag here against Chason. And this is one thing you worry about with like certain like bendy rushers is that sometimes when he's out of position, he can get like a little lungy and he doesn't use his arms and his hands in like the perfect way. He a lot of times will like try to get this jab in, but I don't know if it's like always really purposeful. I don't think it always like throws off the rush. I think it's more to kind of like he uses it to like recenter himself sometimes, but I don't think it's always like purposeful. And so he's going to pick up the flag here. He just picks up the face mask on Chason. Because again, he gets beat to the outside. He's a little late out of his stance here. Because while like we talk about like corners like turning and running, which I think he's pretty good at. Like once his hips are flipped, if he wants to get like push you past the pocket, he's usually pretty good. But part of how he plays his set kind of puts him behind the 8 ball, so to speak. And it affects the rest of the overall rep. It contributes to this penalty right here because he's just not in a good position. So this is from Leatherwood's 2019 film. I think this kind of shows how sometimes he can like fall off of blocks in the run game. And I think part of it is like body positioning, hand positioning. And he's going to go up and under. He's going to get that outside arm on the outside shoulder. He's going to get that inside arm about rib area. I don't think he really locks on with the inside arm. And he's running his legs through. Now I think some players will kind of like adjust their body positioning to kind of like cut off the inside during the rep. And with Leatherwood, he's really only got, at this point, like late into the rep, he's really only got that inside arm, like kind of as the final resistance point in terms of like keeping control of the block. And his blocker's able to get loose, and Najee's he's just past the point to where he's not going to make the tackle. But I think in terms of Leatherwood's like overall game, I think especially early on, I think sometimes he has a tendency to like wind up with his punch and kind of like misplace where he wants to get his hand positioning. And this play, he doesn't. But in terms of like maintaining the integrity of the block, if the inside arm, which is really not like grasped on, it's really not like fully locked on. I don't think he like is fully grabbing cloth here. I think you'd probably want to position yourself a little bit differently if you want to like maintain the integrity of the block the full way through. I think that's something you can work on though. So you can generally just do more cool stuff with really talented players. And here's a play where Leatherwood's pulling play side from the tackle position. He's technically a second level block and flattens him at the end. He really finished this Georgia game really well. The only thing that you wonder about him, when you're looking at like second level blocks overall, sometimes he has a tendency to like overrun his target. If he doesn't do that, he's absolutely golden. And you see plays like this. And part of the reason he overruns it is because he's so explosive out of his stance. I think sometimes he just doesn't have that like overall throttle down mindset, even though I think physically he can do it. And that's a big distinction to make. And so when I see a player who can physically do it and then is just capable of like really impressive plays, and like this one, I tend to view them a little bit more favorably. It depends what the other parts of their game are. A player like Greg Little, I wasn't quite as high on it as I currently am with Alex Leatherwood, but the high end stuff from him, it's just really high end. So we talked about Leatherwood kind of having like the same issues in terms of like his overall tackle projection and his guard projection. I went back to 2018 to watch some of him at guard, and he actually impressed me a good amount. If you label him as a guard first, I don't blame you, and I actually really do get it. Here he is against Christian Wilkins right here, reworking his hands, get disengaged from the blowback initially. I think he's handling this rep well overall. He had a lot of good plays from this game. I think you still have like when we talk about guards, how you use your hands is I think it's a very underrated part of being a guard, and that's the one thing that's kind of holding me up from saying like, okay, he can just be like an unreal guard. But if that can get better, he could be a very explosive guard because we know he can down block. Certain things at the second level, I think he does really well too. He can uproot players. He's just a really explosive player. For a guard, he would be an extremely good athlete. And if you could shore up some of the technique, some of his redirection questions as well, I think against some bigger players might not be an issue. So if you're considering him as a guard, I actually really don't blame you. And I kind of changed my tune as I was making this video a little bit. But I think overall the issues are still somewhat similar between the two positions. If he fails a tackle, I think he actually could be a pretty damn good guard. So there's a lot more that I want to show, but I think this kind of touches on most of it. The one thing I don't know if I completely emphasized was he does have a tendency to fall off blocks. I think there's a lot of reason. Part of it's explosiveness out of the stance, part of it's hand technique, part of it's body positioning as well, or how he plays his set, or leverages himself during the run rep. That's the one thing that is like a little bit concerning about Leatherwood. But overall, I think he's, just as an overall lineman prospect, one of the better guys that I've seen so far in this class. And I think he's being a little bit underrated by some people. I think the league's kind of split on him a little bit too. I understand why, but I'm on the higher end of where I see him. There's only so many athletes that are this level explosive. I don't have any issues with like competitive toughness either with him, or his anchored, or just like his ability to uproot players. So you wish you saw a little bit more consistency and maintaining integrity of the blocks and certain parts of his game, his overall technique. I think he needs to make some adjustments to his pass set, but overall, this is definitely one of the better linemen in the class. Someone I was not as high on early, came around a little too late, especially when I saw that guard tape. So I think he's definitely a top 50 player. For me, he's a top 40 player. I'm definitely on the higher side, but I just like him, and I think he's going to be a pretty good pro.